Hello and welcome to the Mental Health Book Club podcast with your hosts Sydney Timmins and Becky Lawrence. We would like to take this opportunity to let you know that we will be covering a diverse range of mental health topics that may be distressing to some listeners. You can find a full list of the topics being covered in each episode in the show notes. Please check the show notes before listening to any of our episodes. Welcome to the Mental Health Book Club podcast with your hosts Sydney Timmins and
Becky Lawrence.
And this is part 3 of our discussion of A Beginner's Guide to Being Mental, an A to Z from Anxiety to Zero Given by Natasha, Devon, MBE. And because Natasha has written such a fantastic book, all we keep doing is talking about it. So we have 2 more letters that we wanted to discuss, which are W for
weed and other non-prescription drugs.
And also X for
the X chromosome.
So men.
And, well, gender.
Yeah. So let's start again with the book blurb.
Am I normal? What's an anxiety disorder? Does therapy work? These are just a few of the questions Natasha Devon is asked as she travels the UK campaigning for better mental health awareness and provision. Here, Natasha calls upon experts in the fields of psychology, neuroscience and anthropology to debunk and demystify the full spectrum of mental health. From A, anxiety, to Z, zero given. Or the art of having high self-esteem, via everything from body image and gender to differentiating sadness from depression. Statistically, 1 in 3 of us will experience symptoms of mental illness during our lifetime. Yet all of us have a brain, so we all have mental health regardless of age, sexuality, race or background. The past few years have seen an explosion in awareness, yet it seems there is still widespread confusion. A Beginner's Guide to Being Mental is for anyone who wants to have this essential conversation, written as only Natasha, with her combination of expertise, personal experience and humour, knows how. So let's get started with W, which is for weed and other non-prescription drugs. So basically the ones that you don't get prescribed by the doctor.
So marijuana, cocaine, heroin...
Yeah.
Amphetamines, all of those kind of things that we're discussing.
But also covering alcohol as well.
Yeah. Even though that is something that you can pick up easily in a lot of places, there's no real restrictions other than age. So you have to be over 18. And if you are looking very young, so shop assistants are asked to check your identification.
For anyone who appears under 25.
And all I can say is, I wish I still appeared under 25. I haven't been ID'd for ages.
Yeah, it hasn't happened to me for a few years. But then I don't buy alcohol very often either.
I only
don't
buy
drink.
it for Lawrence. So yeah, I don't drink either. And if you've read Natasha's book, she takes sertraline. I also take sertraline. So I can completely understand her identification of 3.5 sips of alcohol and she was gone.
Yeah. Well, she talks about how avoiding drugs and alcohol is important to self-care when it comes to mental health, because it causes mood swings and interferes with your prescription drugs. And also, alcohol and drugs floods the body with dopamine, and that becomes excessive. It is called a disinhibitor, which means that you are more likely to take risks and you're more likely to have cloudy thinking. She isn't saying that it's all bad, and actually a lot of people are approached her and say, well, not everyone that takes drugs or drinks alcohol are addicted or have a problem either. But what she's saying is that she hasn't actually met anyone who does any of that and is happy. So
that's true.
Maybe actually we do need to look at this in a bit more detail. She also talks about the difference between how when she was a teenager, it was around the time when a girl called Leah Betts died of MDMA in ecstasy at a party. And
didn't her parents put out pictures and things?
Yeah, and I think every school there was the video, and the family did a whole documentary about how it affected them and stuff like that. When Natasha was at school, and I think when we were at school, because we're from the sort of same generation, we kind of equated drugs to death because of this. So you either died or you went to prison.
Yeah,
if you got involved in drugs.
There wasn't really anything in between, was there?
No. And although when I was a teenager there was a bit of marijuana around, there was nothing really stronger than that. I didn't even know how to get anything stronger, and I didn't even get involved in the marijuana that others were.
And I wouldn't necessarily even have known where to get it from. So yeah, I was extremely sweet and innocent.
So whereas the current generation actually have a truth gap, because young people are told that they're bad, but actually they've got examples of their friends and people they know that actually have taken drugs and haven't died and haven't gone to prison.
Yeah, and also in some like celebrity culture where there's a load of celebrities in and out of rehab for some kind of addiction or another, and you see them and you go, well, they're quite successful. it can't be that bad, and they're kind of getting some kind of treatment for it.
Yeah. So to millennials, really, recreational drugs are less of a big deal as to perhaps our generation and before. So we have to understand that as well. And she does point out there's a lack of change in the education about drugs with that in mind. So the education in schools has kind of stayed the same.
Drugs are bad.
Which they are. And she does say, like, no illegal drug is ever going to be totally safe, because you don't know where it's come from, you don't know how it's made, you don't know what reaction you're going to have, just like with prescription drugs. There's side effects, there's bad reactions and things like that.
And there is ongoing debate in Parliament about whether we should legalise certain drugs. I mean, they've increased the classification of some of them to, if you are in possession of certain drugs, you now get longer jail terms and more repercussions associated. Yeah. And I saw a headline this morning from The Guardian stating that if they were to legalise marijuana, the Treasury could earn up to £3.5 billion.
Probably in taxes of selling it. Yeah,
exactly.
The problem with this, and Natasha touches on this, is that marijuana and hallucinogenics have been linked to depression and psychosis. And that link doesn't necessarily mean that one causes the other, because you might be taking one because of the depression and psychosis. It's very hard to link out the cause and consequence. Yeah. But saying that, because our brains continue to develop until we're about 23, 25 sometimes, if you're taking these drugs at a younger age, that it means that your brain is going to develop differently, and it might not necessarily create the pathways that you need to have healthy mental health. Yeah. And so they do think that maybe it's that taking it at a young age that can cause long-term mental health illnesses in young people.
But I can also see the argument for potentially legalising it, because you've got this issue where if you've legalised it, you've at least got some control over what supply is going out onto the market.
Yeah, and what it contains and how it's grown and the quality. And actually, the government actually do grow cannabis in the country to actually...
It can help different conditions such as cancer patients. So if you have cancer and you are going through chemotherapy, if you have high nausea rates, taking a form of cannabis can help to reduce that.
It's been recommended for fibromyalgia.
It's also been recommended for remitting multiple sclerosis and other forms of multiple sclerosis.
Yeah.
So there are therapeutic uses for marijuana.
But the government grow it to actually test against the ones that are coming in to see the qualities and things like that.
Which is interesting.
Which means they're growing really high quality and comparing it against what is coming into the country, and often find that it's cut with a lot of other substances to actually, which are then more harmful. I mean, the same happens to all drugs. I worked for Surrey Police before I was a teacher, and worked in high-level drugs and firearms crime. I wasn't an officer, I was a civilian. But I knew of cases where we'd seen like cocaine being cut with cement, and that's scary. It's really scary. And there were deaths by drugs because a batch had gone bad or a batch had been mixed with something bad, and deaths happen. So it is, by legalising it, you have more control over it. And I'm not saying I'm necessarily pro-legalisation. I'm not really sure where I stand on it. I have a really mixed view. I think because it is illegal at the moment, and I so strongly believe in following the rules, because that's part of my personality, I kind of have this, should we, shouldn't we? And I also think the effect on young people. So I think if they are going to legalise it, I think you'd have to do it from like 23 or 25 up.
And it would have to be a case of you can get it only by prescription, maybe, rather than just being able to walk in and buy a bag of whatever.
Over the counter.
Kind of system. So just a little bit more about this particular article. It stated that if the Treasury hit cannabis with a tax set at the same level as alcohol, they would get in almost $2 billion. If they then taxed cannabis in the same way that they taxed tobacco, that could be up to 3.5 billion generated. Wow. So, and these things, you can understand if people are still going to do it, I think.
But the fact that those statistics are even there shows that someone's been looking into this, which worries me, because we are in a capitalist economy. And as we've said before, a lot of things, money is put ahead of people's well-being. And so it worries me that the government might actually do something like this because of the money.
Apparently, the reason why that they are suggesting this, or one of the reasons that they could go with this, is because it could plug the gap in the NHS budget. That's what it states in the article.
Wow.
So let's legalise cannabis, and we could ensure the survival of the NHS. I don't know, a little scary, maybe.
Yeah, because then you ask how many more people will be signing up to go and get it. Would it actually flood the NHS at first for people who want it or demanding it?
Yeah, it's interesting.
We're going to have more pharmacy raids for these kind of things.
It's a possibility, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's a distinct possibility.
Okay, so the other bit of this chapter is mainly about addiction and how addiction's always really been thought that the substance causes the addiction. But research has actually shown that it can be environmental. And Professor David Nutt actually says that it's actually to do with the brain being wired to overreact to stress. And so people who have that composition in their brain are more likely to use alcohol and drugs to take the edge off because their brain is wired to be more stressed. And then that makes them liable to addiction. And this has been linked also with bulimia nervosa because there's an addiction with food and then it's a compensatory behaviour that actually kicks in after that. So that's been linked. She also talks about a rat park that was...
Although you thought that this was Rat Pack, which
I
is
know,
hilarious.
I read this at Rat Pack and then I had to reread it. So in 1970, they were investigating cocaine addiction and they actually now think it's an environmental factors that cause addiction, not the cocaine itself. And they did this by setting up a rat cage that was like Rat Disneyland.
And all I can say is, well, hey, Disneyland.
Especially as it had an area they could go and...
mating area.
Yeah.
I reckon all Disneylands from now on should have a mating area.
And then they had the rats that are in the normal laboratory cages. And they found that the rats in the Disneyland didn't go for the bottle of water that was laced with the drug, whereas the ones in the lab cage did. And so they're thinking that it's more about environment. Now, I said, is that more about the fact that they didn't have anything else to do, so it was like a boredom kind of thing? Or is it actually about they were happier, so therefore they didn't go for it?
It would be interesting to read that particular article. Yeah. And it might be something that I suggest that the secret psychiatrist has a look into to be able to pull it apart for us.
Yeah, definitely. Well, then Natasha talks about psychological addiction and how it's characterised by really two factors. The first one is low self-esteem, so the need to fix or sort of a self-hatred or self-harming aspect. And then the second is a fractured sense of self, where the self that you feel inside and the self that you put a mask on for the outside world, that gap between the two getting bigger and bigger is actually maybe what causes that. And that to make that gap smaller, you need a sense of acceptance and belonging, which we've talked about before. Natasha comes down to 3 general rules. So to sort of assess whether you need to go and get help for drugs and alcohol. So she says, if you feel you need a drink or a fix, then you probably shouldn't, and you probably need to go and ask for help because the problems are still going to be there. If you're drinking more than 4 units a day or using drugs regularly, then you probably do need to go and ask for help. And remember that illegal drugs are never completely safe. So I thought it was a really interesting chapter, especially when it came to sort of the idea around addiction, because I come from a family where my granddad was an alcoholic and he was violent towards his wife. And my mum brought me up telling me that we had addictive personalities. It was in our DNA. So we had to be really careful. And my mum is pretty much addicted to TV and to food. And although she probably wouldn't recognise that herself, we can see that. And so I was always brought up with this fear of being addicted to something. So I've always tried my hardest to not get addicted to stuff. Does that make sense?
It does make sense.
Whereas actually, if addiction is more environmental, then she set up an environment to make me scared of being addicted, which probably means that's why I'm not addicted.
Yep.
But at the same time, maybe I wouldn't have got addicted because of the environment anyway.
Yeah.
So yeah. It just made me think, really, about the way I perceive addiction.
Yeah, it is interesting.
Because often with addiction, we blame people for their addictions as well, especially when they relapse and things like that.
We shame you for having an addiction.
Yeah, we have less compassion for people who are alcoholics or who have drug addictions.
Or food addictions.
We call them like junkies.
Porn addiction or any kind of addiction, really.
Yeah. And I think that's partly because there feels like there's a choice in when you take that maybe for the first time. So therefore, for example, I've never smoked a cigarette in my life.
I haven't either.
Yeah. My uncle died of lung cancer. My nan's dog died of cancer that was related to smoking because she smoked so much in her house. My sister couldn't visit her because she smoked so much she'd get an asthma attack. It was just I was just surrounded by it at a young age, so I never really wanted to do it. So if someone smokes for the first time and say the addiction is actually, nicotine, they say, is addictive, therefore they chose to take that first cigarette, therefore are they responsible for the addiction that comes afterwards?
But then there's also peer pressure associated with things such as smoking and drinking
and drugs.
And I mean, and you have been told that, like, by people that are like, oh, you don't drink, and they kind of look at you as if
I'm very strange because I don't drink. And you have to justify it.
I've been told that people have said to me, I don't trust people that don't drink.
What?
Yeah, exactly. And you go, what?
Well, I'm often the person in the pub that orders a cup of tea, and people look at me extremely strangely.
Hey, I went on a hen do, and I drank so many double espressos, the poor waiter guy was like, are you sure you want a third double espresso? Because everyone was
having 6 cocktails, and that was absolutely fine.
Yeah, everyone else was on the cocktails and was, like, buzzing off their heads, and there's me sat there with my double espresso in the corner.
Yeah.
Doesn't mean that I can't have a good time just because I'm on the caffeine.
Yeah, again, another addictive substance.
I mean, I've had to stop the caffeine recently because I was getting jittery, but that's a story for another day.
Yeah.
So our final letter that Becky has chosen is X for the X chromosome. And this really is all about gender and gender issues and the difference between gender and sexuality.
Yeah. Now, the easy to remember this, gender is in your head and sexuality is in your pants. So the way of saying that is gender is how you feel about the way you perceive yourself. Sexuality is separate and is about what you're attracted to. So it is very common that is mixed up. And I think it is very easy to separate that out when you think of it that way, that gender is in your head and sexuality is in your pants.
I agree. I completely agree. And I think that this was really an interesting chapter purely because of the differences that Natasha talks about between men and women. And we've said on numerous podcasts before that we socialise children of a male and a female differently to each other.
Yeah.
And we've talked about the BBC programme that tried to take away gender and allowed little boys to play or do needlecraft and little girls to build guns.
Which Natasha uses in her chapter, actually.
Exactly.
As well.
So we've talked about this before, but I guess the main things that I really wanted to pick up on were the fact that women are 3 times more likely to be okay or diagnosed with anxiety and depression in comparison to men. And this is often used as a reason to say that mental health is not a big issue because women are more likely to be diagnosed with it. They're the ones that are emotional and overreacting and are just moaning about everything. However, if you looked at other mental health issues such as addiction, men are more likely to be addicted to substances than women.
And men are more likely to take their own lives with suicide as well.
Exactly. I mean, it was stated that men under the age of 50, it's the highest rates of suicide, and that is the biggest cause of death. There's also 3 in 4 suicides, which I almost fell off my chair reading. 3 in 4 suicides are completed by men.
75%.
So that's 75% of men are able to complete suicide. And also that the second biggest killer of boys and men aged between 10 and 24 is as a result of suicide. And these are phenomenal statistics. And I couldn't get over it personally.
Yeah, and I think we have to discuss gender more. And there is more of a discussion going on. I know at my school there's a lot more discussion of gender, more acceptance of transgender and all the other many genders that people identify with, or they might identify as no gender. All of that is being much more accepted, but we still need to break down our stereotypes about what makes a man and what makes a woman.
Exactly. So Natasha breaks this chapter down into different sections, such as women are pretty, women are talkative and irrational. In comparison, men are seen as being big and muscly and are stoic in comparison to women.
Yeah. So women are perceived as beauty has become a constant distraction and worry for women. Girl Guiding National Attitude Survey says that 7-year-olds believe that society values them more for looks than their achievement and their character, which I found really heartbreaking. But then saying that, I have a 9-year-old niece who is already worried about how she looks. She's already worried about being fat. She's already worried about the fact that she started developing breasts and what that looks like and what that looks like to others. So, and she's already getting into makeup and things like that. So it does make me sort of understand where that statistic comes from. But I think that's another thing that we should be awarding women for their achievements and for who they are as a person, and getting that much more into the media and that. I mean, Natasha said that when she got her MBE, she was actually
trolled online.
Yeah,
specifically,
and it was about her look and her
ethnicity, and
but also she had another picture of her where she was all dressed up to go to a award ceremony.
Yes,
she wasn't even getting an award, she was going along to a ceremony, and that picture got more likes by people than the one where she won an MBE.
Yeah, which is completely backwards in my opinion.
Yeah, definitely. She also talks about how women are talkative and irrational, or perceived that way, and this becomes socially is more acceptable to talk about it. But the offside of this means that women almost have to go to more extreme measures to actually get the help they want. So there's why that might be one of the reasons that women are
more likely to attempt to take their life.
Yeah. And also the fact that everyone is talking about it kind of normalizes situations. So we've got to be careful that although we want to talk about mental health issues more, we want to also understand that it's not, you don't have to just let that go because you have it. If you're talking about it, it's okay to go and get help. It's okay to then act on it. It isn't that, oh, well, everyone's got issues, so I've just got to deal with it. And I think that's important. To also not put women's feelings down to exaggeration, or they're just a drama queen, or
just being hysterical.
Yeah, I mean, the word hysterical actually comes from the Latin for womb, and it is because
it is your wandering womb that makes you.
It is.
Go away.
Apparently. I mean, throughout medieval times, I teach medieval medicine, and there was this idea of the womb wandering around the body and causing women to be irrationally emotional. And they used to do things like put a bad sense at the sort of around your nose
to make it go back to where it should be.
Yeah, to kind of frighten it back down, and sometimes put a candle, a light near your vagina to actually try and encourage it to go towards the light. There are images of this. It's not images
bizarre.
In photographs. These are images in drawings because it's medieval times.
But still, it's very bizarre when you think about it with 21st century.
But men are the people that wrote medicine. Women were, the witches, the wise women. They dealt with childbirth. They didn't deal with anything academic sense. The first women doctor isn't actually until I think 1860. So women are kind of perceived in that way, whereas men are perceived as big and muscly. And there is a fear to be seen as weak.
Yeah, I mean, I was speaking to my dad the other week, and my dad has extremely un-PC views on life. And he sat there and he went, my work colleague is such a woman, because he needed to take time off because he had some stress going on in his life. And I pushed back. This was the first time I've ever pushed back to my dad. And I went, I take offence to you saying that. Yeah. Because that is, one, unfair to all womankind to say that he is a woman because he is having emotions. And number two, why can't this guy have emotions? What is so bad about having emotions?
And what's wrong with having compassion?
Why I grow up so crazed.
Yeah, what's wrong with having compassion for him to actually allow him to deal with those emotions?
Yeah. And you wonder why I grew up having borderline personality or emotionally unstable personality disorder, because he was the one who was really my emotional barometer. And so we talk about a bit later that women are more socialized to be able to talk about emotions, recognize emotions, identify
more vocabulary.
Emotion. Exactly. Whereas I didn't get that because I was really raised by a father with an emotionally absent mother.
Yeah. And boys do seem to have a limited vocabulary when they've tested them at a young age, and then that would obviously proceed into being a man and what that would be like. There's also the fact that in the media we've got an increased advertising for male grooming products. There's a lot more pictures of men.
So business is now tapping into men's insecurities about their own body image in comparison to what women have been going through for years.
Yeah, I love the point where Natasha said that women have wanted a level playing field with men for a long time, but this doesn't mean that we want to exploit male insecurities so they've got insecurities like we have.
Yeah, exactly.
Which
it's unfair, really isn't it? You go, yeah, that's very true.
Yeah.
Men are also perceived as being stoic, so boys can't cry, and if you have feelings or you have feelings for other people, then you are obviously gay, because that's such a big, huge no-no. Yeah. And you go, well, I remember back at school this kind of thing happening. And I'm assuming you probably still have things like this where you have to go, well, what's wrong with being gay? I don't remember back then ever being said to, like, these boys being told
we actually
what's wrong
do.
with being
I think
gay.
we stand up for it for a lot more these days as teachers than when I was at school. And I do often have the conversation, what is wrong with being gay? And they go, I'm not using it. It's just banter. And I'm just like, no.
It's not banter.
It's not. You're using it in a derogatory sense. So therefore you are trying to say that being gay is derogatory. And they go,
really hate banter.
And the other thing is they go, Miss, are you then gay? Because is that why you're offended? And I was like, no, I'm offended because it's offensive. I'm not offended because I am gay. You don't have to be gay to be offended by your use of that. Yeah. But there might be somebody who has heard that, who is offended, who is gay, and then feels that they can't actually express themselves because it's perceived as being a derogatory term. So I think it's really important to keep saying that to children.
Yeah, definitely. And even to adults in some situations.
Yeah.
I mean, let's be honest, with my dad, he's also used gay slurs and racist slurs, and I bump on them, but I haven't had the confidence to go, you know what, that isn't actually fair. Yeah. To be saying. And now that I'm getting a bit more confident with the things that I'm aware of, and you go, well, yeah, this is what I was brought up with. And I'm conscious about that. And I try, even though there's probably some bias in there somewhere which is unconscious, I'm trying specifically to not be prejudiced to anyone.
Yeah.
So...
Which is really good, because a lot of people would have been brought up in the same way and then just carried on having those stereotypes.
Oh, my stepsister has, definitely.
Yeah. I also think that where Natasha brings up that actually men see violence as preferable to emotions, so almost to the extreme that they'd rather kill themselves than have emotions.
Yeah, exactly. And this thing that you're weak if you give out emotions, and really we should be changing our language to tell people that you're actually strong. I mean, we always end the podcast with, it's okay not to be okay, and if you're not okay, talk. Because talk really is showing how strong you are.
Yeah. I'm always telling students when I recommend things like counselling, it is a strength to ask for help. It is a strength to talk about your feelings and to be self-aware about what's going on. So this brings us on to really the final part of this chapter, where it says about taking away the barriers. So trying to open up and get people to talk about their mental health, no matter what gender.
And don't shame them for it either. It's not a shame for you to be having feelings or being worried about someone else. It's just not.
And doing things like going for a walk with them to try and encourage them to talk. And I was saying how when I'm at school, we're actually encouraged, if you are talking to boys who I teach and they want to express themselves, or you're having trouble trying to get them to express themselves, facing them front on actually is quite confrontational, and they see that and they perceive that without realizing it, and they often don't want to make eye contact with you. Whereas actually if you sit next to them or you go for a walk and you are at their side, or distract them with an activity while talking to them, you're more likely to get more out of them. And that goes for I do it with boys, but I also do it with girls around school who just need that other activity to occupy them while you're trying to discuss it. And really just telling people that it's okay to talk, it's okay to listen to others, and have this discussion about gender stereotyping and keep that going.
And the last thing really is that Natasha also identifies that there are people out there now challenging those gender stereotypes. So we have a book hopefully coming up, I don't know when, but by Robert Webb.
It's on the list.
It's on the list by Robert Webb, and it is his book on how not to be a boy. And I think it is a fascinating insight into how he was brought up to be this tough guy, but actually in reality, he didn't feel like he fitted into that stereotype.
Yeah. So, for example, the comedian Russell Kane, who we went and saw live a little while ago, actually talks about how his dad is a real bruiser, and he does the impression of deep voice and he's got big muscles, and whereas he had this son that was completely not like that, and he had to come to terms with the fact that his son, as he put it, was a bit of a girl, or was very...
Which is unfair.
Yeah. And so Russell actually grew up in an environment where he was sort of perceived to be completely different to what his father was expecting. And that must be really difficult as well. So gender is stereotyping, as well as how people perceive their own genders, is a really important discussion to have.
Exactly. So we'd like to say thank you so much, Natasha, for writing this book.
We could have said so much more. There's so much good chapters.
days, I think. 'Cause
Yeah.
this is what, part 3? We
Yeah.
could have been here for days. So, on that happy note, we'd like to say it's okay to not be okay.
And if you're not okay, talk.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Mental Health Book Club podcast. If you need additional help with your mental health, please contact the Samaritans on 116 123, which is a 24-hour helpline. And if you need additional information about mental health issues, please visit Mind at mind.org.uk. Our next episode with the Secret Psychiatrist will be about maintaining your mental health. And our next book will be A Tiny Piece of Something Greater by Jude Sierra. If you'd like to find out more about the MHBC podcast, please visit our website, mentalhealthbookclub.com. We really hope that you enjoy this podcast, and we would like to hear what you think. Please head over to Twitter and follow us at MHBC_podcast, or head over to Facebook and follow our Facebook page, which is Mental Health Book Club. If you would like to show your support further, please share us with your family and friends and leave us a 5-star review wherever you get your podcasts.